The house was quiet when he found it. Not the comfortable silence they'd shared over breakfast for 30 years. But the hollow kind that settles after someone is gone. He was sorting through her desk drawer, the one she'd always kept locked. Though he'd never asked why when his fingers brushed against an envelope. Tucked beneath old photographs and theater tickets from a life they'd built together. His name wasn't on it. No name was. Inside, pages of her handwriting. Words that began 100 times and stopped, sentences that circled back on themselves. Like someone trying to find their way out of a maze. The ink changed colors, blue to black to blue. Again, as if she'd returned to this letter across months, maybe years. He sat down in her chair and began to read. Now, let's find out what really happened. I never meant for any of this. That's what everyone says, isn't it? The ones who cross lines they promised themselves they'd never approach. But I'm saying it anyway. Because it's true, and because there's no one left to lie to. I was 43 when I met him. Not young, not old. Just existing in that middle space. Where you've accepted that the big moments are behind you and what remains is maintenance. Maintenance of a marriage, of a career teaching ninth graders. Who barely looked up from their phones, of a version of myself. I'd agreed to become somewhere along the way. My husband was a good man. Is a good man. I need you to understand that first. He never raised his voice, never forgot our anniversary. Never looked at me the way some men look at their wives, like furniture they've stopped noticing. We had routines. Saturday morning farmers market. Wednesday night pasta. Sex on Sunday mornings when the light came in soft through the bedroom curtains. It was enough. I told myself it was enough. The coffee shop where I met him wasn't even my usual place. Mine was closed for renovations, and I'd walked 3 blocks further. Just to get my morning ritual back. He was sitting at a corner table with a book. Not his phone, a real book with a broken spine and margin notes. I wouldn't have noticed him except he looked up right as I was looking, and he smiled. Like he'd been caught at something. We didn't speak that day. But I came back the next morning. And the morning after that. And on the 4th day, when the seat across from him was empty. He gestured to it like he'd been saving it all along. His name doesn't matter now. What matters is that he asked me what I was reading, and I told him. And for the first time in years someone actually listened to my answer. Not the polite listening you do while mentally preparing your own response. But the kind where you can feel someone receiving your words. Turning them over, considering them. We talked about books. Then about teaching, because he'd been one 2 years ago. Before he'd moved into something else. Then about the small disappointments that accumulate in a life, the novel you never wrote, the graduate program you never applied to, the person you'd imagined becoming who got quietly shelved. I told him things I'd never told my husband. Not because my husband wouldn't have listened. But because I'd never thought to say them out loud. I'd forgotten they were even there. It went on like this for weeks. Just coffee. Just conversation. I told myself it was harmless. This friendship with a stranger who knew nothing about my mortgage or my mother's dementia. Or the way my husband clicked his teeth when he concentrated. This man only knew the part of me. I chose to show him the part that still read poetry and had opinions about art. And remembered what it felt like to want something. He made me feel visible. That's the dangerous part. Not the wanting, but the being seen. The first time he touched my hand, it was an accident. We were both reaching for the same book I'd brought to show him, and our fingers overlapped for maybe 2 seconds. I pulled back like I'd been burned. He apologized. We both laughed, but the air between us had changed. After that, every conversation felt like standing at the edge of something. I started lying to my husband. Small lies. I had to stay late to help a student. There was a faculty meeting. The errands took longer than expected. He never questioned me because I'd never given him reason to. That's what 30 years of trust looks like. It makes deception easy. We kissed on a Tuesday afternoon. In his car in the parking lot behind the library. Rain was drumming on the roof and I was crying before his mouth even touched mine because I knew that everything was about to split in. To the life I'd built and the person I actually was. I wanted to stop. I wanted to never stop. The affair lasted 4 months. We never spent a full night together. Never went to a hotel, never made plans beyond the following week. It existed in stolen hours, in his apartment on Thursday afternoons. When my husband thought I was at yoga. It was breathless and guilty and more alive than I'd felt in a decade. He never asked me to leave my husband. I never offered to stay. We talked about everything except what we were doing. What it meant. What came next. And then one day I looked at him. Sleeping beside me in the narrow bed he'd probably had since college. And I felt such a wave of grief I thought I might drown in it. Not grief for what I was losing, but for what I'd already lost: the simplicity of my life before, the certainty that I was a good person. The ability to look at my husband without feeling my heart crack open. I got dressed while he slept. Left a note on his kitchen counter that said only I can't. I never went back to that coffee shop. He texted me for a while. Long messages at first, then shorter ones. Then silence. I changed my number. Deleted everything. Tried to pretend it had been a dream. The kind that feels real while you're inside it but dissolves the moment you wake. But you don't wake from something like that. You carry it. It becomes part of your blueprint. This knowledge that you're capable of betraying everything you thought you stood for. I went back to my husband. To our routines. To the version of myself I'd agreed to be. He made me feel alive again, and I hated him for it. Because now I knew what I was missing. And I had to live with that knowing for the rest of my life. The first letter I wrote to him, I burned in the kitchen sink. It was 3 weeks after I'd left his apartment for the last time. And I'd convinced myself that if I could just explain, if I could just make him understand, then maybe the weight pressing against my chest would lift. I watched the paper curl and blacken, and I knew I'd do it again. Writing to him became my confession. Not to God, not to my husband. Not even really to him, to the part of myself that refused to be quiet. The part that still reached for the phone at odd moments, that composed messages I'd never send while standing in line at the grocery store, that woke in the middle of the night. With his name on my lips. I kept the letters in that locked drawer. Dozens of them, eventually. Some only a few lines, some pages long. All of them unfinished, because there was no way to finish something that never should have started. I wrote about ordinary things. A student who'd finally understood a poem we'd been studying. The way the light fell through the classroom windows on October afternoons. A piece of music I'd heard on the radio that made me think of the morning. We'd sat in his car listening to rain. I wrote about my marriage. How it continued, quiet and steady as always. How my husband still brought me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings, still touched my shoulder when he passed behind my chair. Still assumed I was the person he'd married. How I let him assume it because the alternative was unthinkable. I loved my husband. That was the truth that made everything harder. I didn't love him the way I'd loved that other man, with that desperate, consuming intensity that feels like dying and being reborn in the same breath. I loved him the way you love a house you've lived in for decades. Its flaws are familiar. Its rooms know your footsteps. It shelters you from the weather and asks nothing in return but that you stay. Some nights I'd lie beside my husband while he slept, and wonder if he could sense it the way I'd been hollowed out and refilled with something different. Some essential piece removed and replaced with guilt and longing, and the memory of being someone else. But he never asked, and I never told. The letters became my survival. On paper, I could say the things that had no place in my actual life. I could be both the faithful wife and the woman who'd betrayed everything. I could miss someone desperately while cooking dinner for someone else. I could hold contradictions that would have torn me apart if I'd tried to speak them. I wrote about desire. Not the physical kind, though that was part of it. But the desire to be seen as I actually was, messy and uncertain and carrying questions. I'd learned to stop asking out loud. The desire to be more than someone's wife, someone's teacher, someone's daughter taking care of her aging parents. I wrote about fear, that I'd wasted my life being safe, that I'd thrown away my one chance at something real, that I'd never feel that alive again, and would spend the next 30 years pretending I didn't notice the difference. Sometimes I wrote to apologize for ending it so abruptly, for not being brave enough to choose him, for loving him and my husband both in different ways that couldn't coexist. Sometimes I wrote in anger at him for seeing me so clearly, at myself for letting him, at the whole impossible situation that had no good ending. And sometimes I wrote just to remember what it had felt like. The weight of his hand on my back. The way he laughed with his whole body. The conversation that had felt like coming home to a place I didn't know I'd been missing. Years passed like this. My mother died. My husband retired. We moved to a smaller house with a garden we'd always talked about planting. I taught my last class and accepted my colleagues' well wishes and emptied my classroom of 3 decades worth of accumulated paper and hope. The letters came with me to the new house. I couldn't throw them away. They were evidence that I'd been more than this quiet life suggested. That I'd wanted something fiercely, even if I'd never let myself have it. My husband found me crying once, late at night, sitting at the kitchen table with a pen in my hand. He asked if I was all right and I told him. I was just feeling sentimental about teaching, about getting older, about time moving faster than it used to. He made me tea and sat with me until I'd finished. And I loved him for not pushing, for giving me space for whatever I needed to feel. But I also resented him for not pushing, for not demanding to know what was wrong, who I was writing to, what secrets I'd been keeping. Because maybe if he'd asked, I could have told him. Maybe if he'd broken through that wall of routine and politeness we'd built, I could have been honest. Maybe we could have saved something I didn't even know was dying. But he didn't ask, and I didn't tell. Writing was the only place I could be honest, not with him, not with myself, but with the part of me that still believed in love. Not the kind you build a life on, but the kind that burns through you and leaves you changed. The kind that ruins you for ordinary happiness, but gives you something to carry through all the years when you're just going through motions. I never sent any of the letters, but I never stopped writing them either. They were my evidence that I'd been alive, that I'd felt something beyond contentment and duty, and the slow erosion of self that comes from choosing safety over truth. And in some strange way, writing them was enough. Or I told myself it was enough, which amounts to the same thing. He found the letter on a Wednesday morning in March. 5 months after I'd died. 5 months of going through a house we'd shared for 20 years. Sorting what to keep and what to give away. Learning how to be alone in rooms that had always held 2 people. He'd avoided my desk. Respected my privacy even after privacy no longer mattered. But the estate lawyer needed documents and he couldn't put it off anymore. The key to the drawer was in my jewelry box, where he'd known it would be. Inside tax returns, old report cards from students, photographs of people he didn't recognize, and beneath it all, the envelope. He knew immediately he shouldn't open it. Knew that whatever was inside had been kept from him deliberately. That some doors close for good reason. But he opened it anyway. At first, the words made no sense. Fragments of thought, half-finished sentences, dates scattered across years. Then slowly, like developing a photograph, the shape of it emerged. Another man. An affair that had ended before he'd ever known to look for signs. Letters written to someone whose name she never used, whose face he'd never seen, who'd occupied a space in her life he hadn't known existed. He read sitting at her desk, then standing at the window, then sitting again because his legs wouldn't hold him. The first emotion was rage. Pure and simple and justified. She'd lied to him, betrayed him, let him believe in a marriage that had been compromised, had been broken in ways he'd never suspected. He wanted to throw the letters away, burn them like she'd burned that first one, erase this knowledge and go back to the version of his wife he'd been allowed to know. But he kept reading, and somewhere in the pages, between the guilt and longing and self-recrimination, he began to see her differently, not as the woman who'd betrayed him, but as a person he'd somehow failed to fully notice. Someone with desires she'd learned to bury, questions she'd stopped asking, a hunger for something he hadn't known she needed. He read about the coffee shop meetings, the Thursday afternoons, the grief she'd carried for ending it, and beneath all of it, a love for him that was quieter than what she'd felt for that other man but no less real. A choice to stay that had cost her something he'd never paid her back for. She'd written, "I loved my husband the way you love a house you've lived in for decades. Its flaws are familiar. Its rooms know your footsteps." He'd read those words and wept. Not because she'd compared him to a house, but because he understood what she meant. Understood that he'd done the same thing, loved her out of habit and comfort rather than attention. Let their marriage become a routine they performed instead of a living thing they tended. He tried to remember the year she must have been having the affair. Tried to recall if she'd seemed different, distant, alive in ways he'd failed to notice. But their life had been so steady, so predictable, that one year bled into the next without distinction. Had she seemed happy? Sad? Had she looked at him and wanted to tell him? Had she lain beside him at night holding her secret like a stone? He'd never asked, never looked closely enough to see past the surface of their shared routines. She'd written, "Sometimes I wonder if he could sense it the way I'd been hollowed out and refilled with something different." And he had to admit no. He hadn't sensed anything, hadn't been paying attention, had assumed that the woman making his coffee and sharing his bed and discussing what to have for dinner was the whole of who she was. He read about her desire to be seen, not just looked at, but truly seen, the complicated, contradictory person beneath the roles she played. And he realized that in 30 years of marriage, he'd never asked her the kinds of questions that might have revealed that person. What did she want? Not what did they want together, but what did she want for herself? What had she given up? What did she dream about? When she let herself dream, who would she have been if she'd made different choices? He'd never asked because he'd been comfortable, because the marriage they had worked well enough, and he'd seen no reason to disturb it. But she had wanted to be disturbed, had needed it, and when he'd failed to provide it, she'd found someone who would. The anger came back in waves. Grief too, for the version of his marriage he'd believed in, for the wife he'd thought he'd known, for all the years they'd wasted going through motions instead of being honest. But beneath the anger was something else, a strange, painful gratitude. She could have left him, could have chosen that other man and the intensity he'd offered, could have blown up their life and started over. Instead, she'd stayed, chosen the safety of their marriage, even though it meant burying part of herself. Chosen him, not out of passion but out of commitment, out of a kind of love he'd been too comfortable to recognize as love. She'd written, "I went back to my husband, to our routines, to the version of myself I'd agreed to be." And he understood finally that she'd made a sacrifice, that staying had cost her something, that he'd asked for that cost without knowing he was asking. He read the letters over days, then weeks, returned to certain passages, trying to hear her voice in the words, trying to know this woman who'd been his wife, but had also been someone else entirely, someone hungry and uncertain and capable of betrayal and redemption both. He thought about his own life. The person he'd been before marriage had smoothed his edges, routinized his days. The dreams he'd stopped mentioning because no one seemed interested. The ways he'd also disappeared into the role of husband, provider, steady presence. Maybe they'd both been lonely in ways they'd never named. Maybe the affair wasn't about him failing her, but about both of them failing to stay awake in their own lives. One evening he sat in the garden they'd planted together and watched the light fade. He thought about all the versions of a person you can be: the one you show your spouse, the one you show strangers, the one you keep hidden even from yourself. How we're all multiple people, and maybe the trick is finding someone who gives you room for all of them. He hadn't given her that room, had loved one version of her and assumed it was the whole story. But she'd loved him anyway, had chosen to stay with him even when staying meant giving something up. Had written letters to another man for years, but had never sent them, never acted on them, never left. She'd written, writing was the only place I could be honest. And he thought, I never gave you a place to be honest with me. He didn't forgive her exactly. Forgiveness felt too simple for something this complicated. But he began to understand her in a way he hadn't when she was alive. She'd been human, flawed and hungry and capable of both betrayal and loyalty. She'd wanted more than their life offered but had chosen it anyway. Had carried the weight of that choice in silence for years. And maybe that was love too. Not the passionate kind, but the kind that shows up day after day, even when it costs you something. The kind that doesn't ask for recognition or praise but just keeps going. She'd loved him, yes. But she'd stayed with me. That's where her story ends and where mine begins. He kept the letters, put them back in the locked drawer, and carried them to whatever next chapter his life held. They were part of her now, part of the marriage they'd had, part of the complicated truth of loving someone across decades and still not knowing them completely. He didn't share them with anyone. They weren't his to share. But sometimes, late at night in the house, that was now only his, he'd take them out and read them again. And he'd talk to her, really talk to her in ways he'd never managed when she was alive. He'd tell her what he'd learned, what he wished he'd done differently, how he missed her, yes, but also how he was seeing her clearly for the first time. And sometimes, in the space between words on a page, he could almost hear her answer. The letters stayed in the drawer for 3 more years. He remarried eventually, a woman he met at a grief support group. Someone who understood that love could be complicated, and that people were more than their best or worst moments. They talked about his first wife sometimes. He told his new wife about the letters, about what he'd learned, about how we can spend decades with someone and still only know them partially. Before he died, he put the letters in an envelope with instructions. Not to be destroyed, but not to be shared. Evidence that a woman had lived and loved, and struggled and chosen her own path through an impossible situation. That someone had felt things deeply in an ordinary life. That the small betrayals we commit, and the small redemptions we earn are all part of being human. The letters are still somewhere, maybe. In a drawer, in an attic, in a box. Marked with a name that would mean nothing to anyone who found it now. Words written to someone who never read them. Kept by someone who wasn't supposed to. A record of a woman who was a teacher, a wife, a daughter, and also someone else entirely. Who wanted more than she let herself have. Who loved 2 men in different ways and was faithful and unfaithful both. Who carried her secrets with grace and guilt in equal measure. Who wrote letters to make sense of her life. Who never sent them because some truths are meant to be held, not shared. She never meant for anyone to read her words. But sometimes the things we hide are the only things that save us.